Here's a guy trying to defend the ontological argument.
So what makes an argument for God really weird? Well, most normal arguments for God's existence start from something we observe in the world that points to God. But one argument starts not with what we observe, but with the very idea of God itself. This argument, as my friend Jimmy Akin once put it, claims that, quote, instead of being too good to be true, God turns out to be too good not to be true. The weirdest argument for God's existence is the one that says God has to exist because, well, God. But this is one of those arguments that fits perfectly in the meme where the geniuses and the low IQ people both agree with the profound truth that God must exist by definition, while everyone else thinks that's a crazy idea.
This argument tries to define God into existence by simply saying that existence is part of the definition of God.
So in today's episode, I'm going to give an overview of the ontological argument for God's existence and show how it can be a helpful argument for that case. So let's get started. First, by ontological, we are talking about ontology, the study of being. The ontological argument claims that God just is the kind of being, or God just is being, so God must exist. Therefore, God does exist.
That's different from most versions of the argument that I've heard. This version is compatible with a pantheist idea of God. If God simply is existence itself, then God doesn't need to be a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that created the universe as theologians and Christian philosophers usually define him. By this definition, God isn't necessarily supernatural. Instead, he could simply be nature itself. This is clearly quite different from the God described by the Bible.
The argument's origin can be found in the writings of the 11th century saint and doctor of the church, Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm started with the idea that God is, quote, that which nothing greater can be conceived. If you think God is just a powerful creator of the universe who is made by some other God, then what you are thinking of is not God, because there is something greater than what you're thinking of, the God that made this God.
That's only if you assume that the other God needs to be greater in order to create the God that created the universe. It's not obvious that this is the case. Humans can build robots that are bigger than us, stronger than us, faster than us, and maybe someday even smarter than us. Creators don't need to be greater than their creations.
So now that we understand God is that which nothing greater can be thought of or conceived, what follows from this definition? Well, God must have all power, all knowledge, and all forms of goodness to be that which nothing greater can be conceived.
A being with all knowledge, all power, and all forms of goodness is not actually conceivable. You run into all sorts of paradoxes when you combine those attributes. For example, if a being is all-powerful, he would have the power to do something that he didn't know in advance that he was going to do, but such a being wouldn't have all knowledge. Also, the greatest being of which I could conceive wouldn't be a supernatural being, or a being that created the space-time continuum, because those are inconceivable to me. Also, to say that God has all forms of goodness is meaninglessly tautological if you hold that God to be your standard of goodness. And something that has all forms of goodness would not be capable of doing anything bad, and therefore could not have all power.
St. Anselm then goes on to say the following: if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously, this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality.
This assumes that existing is greater than not existing. That's another problem with the ontological argument. There's no objective way to discern great-making properties from properties that are not great-making. It's not clear to me at all that existing is greater than not existing, because it's not clear exactly what greater means in this context.
So St. Anselm is saying that if you imagine the concept of God in your mind, then that's not really God, because there is something greater than a God that only exists in your mind. Remember, God is that which no greater can be thought. The greater thing would be a God that exists in reality as well, and not just the mind. Therefore, since God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, and a God that exists in reality as well as the mind is greater than a God that exists only in the mind, it follows that God exists.
To prove that something exists is to prove that it is not just fictional. Proving that something exists means proving that its concept has a referent. The biggest problem that I have with every version of the ontological argument is that it tries to prove that something is more than just a concept using nothing but concepts. I don't see how you can prove that a concept has a referent that exists independent of all concepts by appealing to nothing but concepts. The argument just ties the concept of God to the concept of existence, not to existence itself.
But most people, even if they believe in God, suspect that there's something wrong with this deceptively simple argument. One of Anselm's contemporaries, a monk named Gonolo, tried to refute the argument by parodying it in order to show its absurdities, a technique we now call reductio ad absurdum. Gonolo said that one could conceive of an island than which no greater could be conceived, but it wouldn't follow that such a perfect island actually exists. Modern atheists often resort to a variant of Gonolo's reply by saying that the ontological argument could be used to prove absurdities, like that a maximally great pizza must exist.
You could make the statement that the greatest possible pizza in the world exists, and so therefore there must be a greatest possible pizza, and I don't think there is a greatest possible pizza.
Maybe the greatest possible pizza you can conceive of has sauce made by aliens from Andromeda. Does that mean that someone has actually baked such a pizza? Obviously not. Even if you were forced by the definition of greatest to think of such a pizza as existing, that still wouldn't make it actually exist.
So why can't you say the same thing about God?
But this actually isn't a fatal objection to Anselm's argument. Unlike the idea of God, perfect islands or maximally great pizzas are incoherent ideas. The idea of an island that must contain all perfections, or a pizza that contains all perfections, or a pizza of which no greater can be conceived, these ideas are incoherent. They cannot exist in reality.
Yeah, neither can any omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. If you define God as the greatest conceivable being, then to me, you're just talking about the universe, or the multiverse as the case may be. That's the only thing that is conceivably greater than anything else, according to what I understand greater to mean. A non-physical being which created all of space and time, that is conscious and knows everything there is to be known, is incoherent. It's not the greatest conceivable being because it's not conceivable at all.
So we can't even really conceive of them in the mind. In his debate with the late atheist Victor Stenger, William Lane Craig noted that a maximally great pizza is an incoherent idea.
He said, well, couldn't you have a parallel argument for the greatest possible pizza? No, because the notion of the greatest possible pizza is logically incoherent. A greatest possible pizza would be metaphysically necessary in its existence, and therefore it could not be eaten.
And a God that's metaphysically necessary in its existence would not have the power to die, and would therefore not be all-powerful.
And therefore it couldn't be a pizza, because the pizza couldn't be eaten.
An island could always have one more coconut tree to make it greater, or a pizza could always have one more topping to make it greater. That means there is no island or pizza than which nothing greater can be conceived. But there could be a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, because that being had complete possession of what philosophers call great-making properties.
The greatest conceivable being couldn't have complete possession of great-making properties because some great-making properties are mutually exclusive. It's not possible to conceive of a being that has contradictory great-making properties like omnipotence and omniscience or omnipotence and omnibenevolence.
Things like power, knowledge, and existence, things that have intrinsic maximums. They aren't like adding one more coconut tree or one more topping. One can have all power or all knowledge or perfect existence. But if that's the case, then why don't most philosophers, including those who believe in God, accept Anselm's argument? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas said that since we don't have direct knowledge of God's essence or what God is like, this means we must reason to God's existence, which just is his essence, from what we do observe in the universe. So we cannot have self-evident knowledge that God exists, even through something like Anselm's argument. Immanuel Kant's criticism of the argument, though, is the more common one today, and it relies on the idea that existence is not a predicate. It's not a term that describes what something is. Existence is just the fact of whether something is or is not.
In other words, it doesn't make any sense for existence to be a part of a concept's definition. This is close to my argument that by adding existence to a thing's definition, you're just tying the concept of that thing to the concept of existence and not to existence itself. It doesn't demonstrate that a thing exists, it just forces you to think of it as existing.
Now, not everyone accepts Kant's objection to the ontological argument, but most people remain unconvinced of Anselm's distinction between greatness in the mind and greatness in reality as being a real distinction between things.
That's because the concept of greatness in reality is still just a concept. That's why the only non-circular way to demonstrate something's existence is to show it empirically. To show that something has a sensory manifestation gets you outside of mere concepts. Now, of course, sensory manifestations could, if we entertain the possibility of idealism or solipsism, still be just in the mind, but at least they are more than just concepts. To actually point to something and say that right there is what I'm talking about makes your proof more than a priori, which is the bare minimum for any demonstration of existence.
Instead, they view it as just a way of hypothetically talking about things that could exist, i.e., St. Anselm's argument only proves that if God existed, then God would exist necessarily as the greatest maximal being, that which no greater can be conceived. But it can't prove that God actually does exist. Now, in 1960, the philosopher Norman Malcolm offered a summary of Anselm's argument using contemporary philosophical language that focused on the concept of necessary existence, which he says avoids Kant's objection about mere existence not being a predicate, since necessary existence is a unique property that can be predicated.
I'm not sure it can, at least not in a way that ties a concept to existence itself rather than just to a concept of existence.
The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga did something similar in his 1974 book, The Nature of Necessity, with his version of the modal ontological argument. Modal logic is a system of reasoning that helps us understand concepts like necessity or possibility. If something is necessary, then that means it has to be. There can be no world without that necessary thing.
Worlds in modal logic are just conceivable scenarios. To say that a concept is necessary in modal logic is to say that there is no conceivable scenario in which it is contradicted. Plantinga argues that there are no conceivable scenarios in which God does not exist. Obviously, I don't find this argument compelling because it looks to me like the opposite is the case. There are no conceivable scenarios in which a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that is capable of creating all of space-time can exist, let alone must exist. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.